about why philosophers like Bentham would go in the ethical direction that they do. We had said that in the 18th and 19th century, the economic conditions of the average person's life had actually gone down during that period. The irony is also this: for the working class, average life expectancy also went down during the first phases of the Industrial Revolution. And this is because there were no labor laws. Child labor was the what?
Norm.
Child labor was the norm. There have been books written about this, by the way. They specifically designed parts of the factory to be very tightly put together, not just to save space, but the various operations of the factory were actually designed to have children work in them, which is something that I know many people today find to be bizarre. But keep in mind, there are some sectors of the bourgeoisie who think that we should go back to systems of child labor. They certainly have no problem with child labor where?
Overseas.
Yeah, we have no problem shipping factories over to countries where we know that child labor can be exploited. Now, the fact that I use that word exploited sort of shows you my politics already. In other words, I am against this kind of stuff. I think that human life matters more than that. I think that human beings should not just be treated as pieces of machinery. Even though I know on some level, most workplaces treat workers like pieces of machinery. They just legally can't do it as much as they might like to. Anyway, my cynicism is shown there too. But anyway, let's lay out the basics of utilitarianism. The founder of simple utilitarianism is a fellow by the name of Jeremy Bentham. A lot of his writing was in the 1840s. He was an interesting character. I don't want to go into too much detail about his bio, but he was close friends with John Stuart Mill's father, James Mill. He was also godfather to John Stuart Mill. Oh, and just to give you another side note, John Stuart Mill knew the parents of Bertrand Russell very well. So a lot of these British philosophers, sort of have a certain relationship and lineage with one another. But anyway, Bentham is the founder of simple utilitarianism. And recall, unlike Kantianism, utilitarianism says the morality of our actions is determined not by the intent, but by the what? Morality is determined not by the intent, but by the outcomes or consequences. This is one reason why utilitarianism is sometimes called a consequentialist account of ethics. Because the rightness and wrongness are dependent upon the actual consequences. Now, the author of our text fortunately lays out a little bit of Jeremy Bentham's rationale for utilitarianism. Unlike Immanuel Kant, Jeremy Bentham was acutely aware that human beings might be this by nature. Well, Kant thought so too. He just thought we could overcome it. Jeremy Bentham contended that it might be possible that we might just be innately egoists by nature, and that our innate egoism may not be able to be ever overcome. To say that we are egoists is to say that we are self-interested by nature. Now you'll notice for Immanuel Kant, if your intent was to do anything whatsoever self-interested, no matter how pure the action ended up looking, you technically weren't deserving of moral credit for it. Now, according to psychological egoism, there's no such thing as a selfless act. So technically, none of us really deserve that kind of moral credit. Yeah?
So even saving someone from a burning building is not a self. So according to psychological egoism, saving someone from a burning building is not a selfless act.
It's not a selfless act. I don't think it's a selfless act at all. The reason I help people out is because it makes me feel good to help people out. You know what I'm talking? Even when I shouldn't cut people breaks, I oftentimes cut them a break. It has to do with the fact that I would feel guilty inside if I didn't, knowing that I had potentially harmed somebody else, because I have this uncanny ability to put myself in other people's shoes. It's not a good thing. And this is one reason why I'm terrible at business. I'm a pushover. People walked all over me. Bad move. That's the way I am. But it's not because I'm like a good person or anything like that. It's because I've got this deep ability to emotionally feel the pain of the other. And I don't like feeling the pain of the other. So to get rid of the pain, I make sure I don't cause pain. So in other words, what somebody might say, oh, what a fine altruist. No, it's basically I don't want to hurt myself. Oh, and by the way, many people who behave like so-called heroes, keep in mind, they're getting paid. And if you're getting paid, is it really altruistic anyway? And by the way, I would run into the burning building to save someone, because I'd be in all the papers. I could get a book deal and so forth. According to psychological egoism, there is no such thing as a selfless act. Well, Bentham says no matter for that. Because through egoism, we can actually show that there's an argument that would lead people to realize that to be an effective egoist, you have to act like a what? In order to be an effective egoist, you have to effectively act like an altruist. Now, altruism means something like this: to have a genuine concern for the welfare or interests of others. Now, strictly speaking, if psychological egoism is true, then pure altruism is not technically possible. However, it is still possible for me to act the same way a pure altruist would. Because if I understand what's in my real best interest, it's not just to look out for myself in what terms? In narrow, short terms. If I want to look out for my greater well-being, I recognize that I am involved with the lives of other people. I realize I'm probably not going to live for just a week. In other words, I've got a plan for the future and so forth. So it actually behooves me in the long run, whether I know it or not, to look out for the interests of other people. Because if I look out for the interests of other people, they're going to be more likely to look out for my interests. That is my short version of his egoistic argument for altruism. Now, in order to get there in a long-winded way, and some of you did the homework question on this, Jeremy Bentham, he constructs something that's called the philosophic calculus. It's also sometimes called the hedonic or the hedonistic calculus. This word felicity and pleasure, they mean the same thing. Felicity is just a word that's kind of archaic, it's gone out of style. Now what Bentham contends is that morality ought to be codified as if it were a science. Why would you want to codify morality as if it were a science? Why do you think these people at this time period thought it was an appealing thing to turn things like morality into a science? What's the beauty of sciences, Mr. Hunter?
It's fact.
Yeah, well, I'll use a slightly different word, but that's the right idea. Scientific methods are methodical. In other words, they would give us a very clear-cut method. And that's how we would get to moral facts, by being methodical. Now, what he contends is that in his hedonic calculus, there are a total of 7 criteria that we ought to take into consideration. Guess what I'm not going to make you do? You're not going to have to memorize these 7 criteria. However, you should have an idea of what these criteria amount to. Now, among the criteria that you ought to consider when determining whether or not you ought to do something or not, you should consider how much pleasure will it get you. All things considered, more pleasure is better than less pleasure. When I say how long, I'm talking about duration. Are short-lived pleasures better or are longer-lived pleasures better, rationally speaking? Longer-lived pleasures are better. I'll give you another one. If this action is going to get me X pleasure, if it is accompanied by Y displeasure, does that change the overall net pleasure that I'm going to get from it? I'll give you a boring example. I've actually stolen it from someone else, but it's pretty basic. Most people think that it is sometimes fun to party and to get dog drunk. Am I correct? It's fun to party, fun to hang out. But most of us realize that that pleasure is what? It's relatively short-lived, and it's almost always accompanied by what? Yeah, various kinds of pain that go along with it. It might be a missed weekend, for example. If you've ever done something so stupid that it put you out of commission, hangover or whatever, for 24 hours, you say, damn, I'll never do that again. Anyone know what I'm talking about? Because the net pain that came along with the fun overrode the pleasure. Or there's the other thing. I mean, there's few people say, I can't wait to sit down and do my philosophy homework. But you do realize what? If you care about the long-term aim of grades and degrees and things of that nature, it behooves you to put up with a little bit of homework now, especially when you keep in mind, if you pay close attention, do your homework, and do your best to learn it, you'll probably have to spend less net time later doing what? I learned this. What's that?
Catching up.
Yeah, catching up. Because technically, if you've been working slowly but surely all along, there were most times that I got to the point that I didn't even study the night before the test. Why? Because I had spent all that time gradually preparing myself. So I didn't need to have a stressful night of study. And guess what? Sure, slow and steady is no fun. However, it made my confidence level greater and so forth. And I also didn't have to cram. And most of us know what about cramming?
Never works.
Is scientifically shown to be ineffective. Ineffective. Because you don't have enough time to get it into your quote-unquote long-term memory. So a little bit of pain now actually tends to lead to net pleasure, more pleasure in the end. Now, I don't want to go into all of the details of this, but one of the things he talks about is purity, but I kind of already talked about purity. In other words, if I do X, will it get me almost all pleasure and no pain? The purer the pleasure, the better. Now, the last of his criteria, criterion 7, is what he calls extent. The first 6 of his criteria relate purely to the self. Now, the 7th of his criteria, is extent. Now, here's what Bentham means by extent. If I take action X, who else is it going to affect? Now, you'll notice that a pure egoist really wouldn't give a rip about how it's going to affect other people. However, a rational egoist who cares about his long-term well-being ought to care about other people's interests. Why? Because they can affect me. Because other people can affect me. If something is very enjoyable to me but harms other people, I don't care how much enjoyment I get out of harming other people. In the long term, harming those people will hurt me. So this gives a no-brainer explanation for why, even if you enjoy hurting people, you shouldn't do it. Because it will bite you back harder in the long run. Jeffrey Dahmer. It is no doubt to me that Jeffrey Dahmer enjoyed the things that he did. I don't get it. And if I did get it, I wouldn't tell you. Good, I got some smiles there. I don't get it. However, if Jeffrey Dahmer had been rational about things, he would have recognized that the things that he did would eventually land him where? Would land him in jail, where he would no longer be able to enjoy himself in that way. And of course, it ended up getting him dead in the long run. Because, yeah, people like that are basically public enemies even in prison. Murderers actually have high status. Pederasts have the lowest of all status. You know, people who like to fondle boys and stuff, they're basically harassed by everyone else in prison. Yeah, even in prison there's a pecking order. Everywhere there's a pecking order. Anyway, I'll shut up about this for now. This is getting a little too morbid even for me. Now the argument here is, if you want to be an effective egoist, you have to become an altruist, according to him. In other words, you ought to look out for the social welfare of others. Now, if I can give you another example to sort of clarify this. Even though this guy comes before Jeremy Bentham, I imagine most of you have heard of Adam Smith. Adam Smith was also a utilitarian, by the way. And by the way, his arguments for laissez-faire capitalism were not arguments in favor of egoism. They were actually arguments in favor of utilitarianism. Take a guess what he presupposed about how his entrepreneurs ought to behave. Yeah.
They ought to behave in a moral way. That way, they're able to maximize. That way, they're able to maximize not only their workers' productivity but their own profits.
Yeah, and I guess I'll give you an even more updated one. Henry Ford. Henry Ford was no friend of the labor movement. He was no friend to his workers, really, but he did understand this. If his workers were not paid decently, they would have work stoppages, strikes. They might even decide to do what to the factory? Yeah, they might even decide to set it on fire or something like that. Back in the day when workers actually acted up and took matters into their own hands, if you weren't a decent employer, things like this might have happened to you. The American working class has lost that kind of fire, pun intended. They're less likely to fight back than they used to be. Now, Henry Ford was no friend to labor, but he did understand also this. If you didn't put enough money into the workers' pockets, how the Hades are they going to be able to buy a Model A Ford? In other words, at the end of the day, it behooves a rational capitalist to do what? To pay their workers a decent wage. Now, exactly what a decent wage means, might vary from economy to economy and from sector to sector. But the idea is if your workers don't have enough money to buy luxury goods, and if your company is selling luxury goods, you're basically shooting yourself in the foot if you don't pay them more than subsistence. This is why Adam Smith would argue that from a utilitarian standpoint, no matter how greedy and cruel his factory owners were, it would rationally behoove them to behave decently towards their workers. Because it will be good for them as owners in the what? Yeah, in the long run. it would be better for them as owners in the long run. Because workers with cash in their pockets are going to be more able to buy stuff. So this is why, from a purely even egoistic standpoint, someone like Bentham would say Malthus was wrong. We should not be basically keeping the working class's subsistence. Because in the end, if the working class are at subsistence, it's going to actually hose us all. Because after all, if our factories are producing goods that our workers can't afford, we'll all be hosed in the long run. So this would be a utilitarian argument for actually paying people more than, quote unquote, what the market will bear, which is oftentimes subsistence. Yeah?
Now, how does this fit into, say, Mills's book on liberty?
I'm going to get there. I'm going to get there. Because I haven't gotten to Mill yet. Now, one of the criticisms we'll see of Jeremy Bentham will actually come from his younger contemporary, John Stuart Mill. Bentham's utilitarianism, I'll write it down again. In Bentham's simple utilitarianism, he made no qualitative distinctions among pleasures, which is just fancy Dan for this. If a person happens to get a large amount of enjoyment playing 5 hours straight of Super Mario Brothers, that is what makes him happy. Even if it might be more long-term edifying for him to read Dickens novels, it's not a matter of what we think. It's a matter of what? Yeah, it's a matter of what brings him pleasure. Pleasure is really a subjective thing, according to Bentham. And to make qualitative distinctions about which pleasures are better than others forgets the fact that if something does not give you pleasure, it will not make you happy, no matter what somebody else thinks about it. So in the end, let me give you some more contemporary examples. I really don't get how anyone, and I hope I'm insulting a few of you, to get your attention. I have no idea how a person can sit down on a Saturday or Sunday afternoon and watch a car go in the same direction around a track for hours upon end. It makes no sense to me. It also makes no sense to me how they can enjoy swilling beers like Busch Long Necks, Old Milwaukee, Jacob's Best. Oh yeah, they don't make that anymore, but yeah, it's pretty much, it was like Meisterbrow. I'm talking about like the lowest brow beers that you can think of. Eating, Homer Simpson pork rinds. I mean, this is like the lowest form of beer and the lowest form of food, and what I would call the lowest form of entertainment. Well, guess what? The people who enjoy watching NASCAR do indeed enjoy watching NASCAR. Who am I to tell them that they're not actually getting pleasure from it? The fact is, they are getting pleasure from it. The same way that listening to some of the music that you people listen to might be torture to me. Then again, if you sat with me in my car and listened to my music, you might not enjoy that. In other words, Bentham is willing to, he doesn't just admit to, he actually argues for the subjectivity of what brings people pleasure. And that there are no objective grounds for saying that certain things are indeed more pleasant than other things. Now, he would say that pleasures that lead to long-term pain, of course, that would suggest that certain things are worse than others, but not objectively speaking, just because of how the hedonic calculus, how should I put it, weighs it out. If you happen to enjoy listening to opera for 3 hours, more power to you. But if they forced me to listen to opera for 3 hours, I'd be clawing at my eyes, man, or I guess my ears. I don't like opera. I also admit this, and I'm going to go on camera saying this. People with nice degrees and pseudo-intellectuals are supposed to like what kind of music? I'm supposed to like classical music. I don't enjoy it at all. I don't like classical music.
So, no Chopin?
No, I really don't care for that stuff. And by the way, I like to remind people that even quote-unquote classical music was designed to be popular music at the time. You're aware of this, right? They made this, I mean, this stuff wasn't supposed to be timeless or whatever, any more than what I like is supposed to be timeless. But we have this idea that because it's old, it's therefore better. And if you don't freaking like listening to Beethoven, then you don't enjoy, I'm lying, I actually do like some Beethoven. But I mean, if you gave me my first choice, it would not be classical music. It would not be classical. It certainly wouldn't be opera. But yeah, some people would say, your taste sucks. You just don't have refined enough taste. I say, well, I've tried. Just like I'll admit, I've taken wine classes. I don't like wine. Refined people are supposed to like wine. I don't like it. I just don't. Some people do enjoy it. And I think if it takes that much effort to cultivate a palate for it, I'm wondering if it's really that damn good anyway. You know what I'm talking about? I'm wondering.